Welcome, and thank you for joining us in a special event known as Time for H.E.A.L. H.E.A.L was designed for those looking to build awareness of their own emotional and psychological experience of racial biases and injustices, to gain tools for assessing unconscious biases on both an individual and organizational level, as well as to engage in healthy race-based dialogue. With the ultimate goal of promoting racial equity and mental health awareness, we invite folks to show up authentically and engage in this movement. Whether you are tuning in or able to join us live, just know that this process will be a journey. H.E.A.L welcomes any adult who can benefit and allows the many employees who are negatively impacted by the onslaught of racial injustices in recent times a place to process and begin the work of self-preservation, especially if your work environment is not already having these types of conversations. Co-creator Dr. Jamila is committed to serving and empowering individuals, organizations, and communities through a strength-based, culturally relevant, and social justice-informed paradigm. With nearly 20 years of experience in mental health, education, and training, she is deeply passionate about this work. Dr. Jamila is also founder and CEO of H.E.A.L Services. Alongside Dr. Jamila, we have co-creator Cindy Joseph, founder and CEO of the C-Suite. Prior to launching her own company, focused on helping organizations across various industries to develop equitable and inclusive talent practices, Cindy spent 2 decades finding and developing diverse talent and managed human capital programs for 2 of the world's leading financial services and consulting companies. Cindy is also a certified professional diversity coach. With their combined experiences and expertise, our incredible facilitators lead us through a thoughtfully designed process known as H.E.A.L. Tonight's event will be facilitated by Juan Camilo Romero, project manager, coach, and facilitator at the C-Suite. Camilo was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia, and is a first-generation college graduate from the University of Florida. Camilo also holds a dynamic background consisting of merchandise marketing, human resources, multicultural community relations, and a deep track record of influencing company culture through cross-functional DEI strategy. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy.
Very excited to have you both here with us today. You both have distinct backgrounds. One's corporate, the other one is clinical health, yet you've come together for a shared mission. So Dr. Jamila, I'd love for you to share with us the concept of H.E.A.L and where it came from and how you both came together in the wake of anti-racism protests.
Sure, Camilo. I'll address it in the reverse order. I'll start out with the quick birth story and then get into what H.E.A.L is really about. Cindy and I met in the summer of 2020. We had a mutual friend who introduced us. It was the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And initially, this mutual friend had a vision of initially me coming into his organization to really address the mental state of employees inside of this very intense racial climate. And he was also going to have his other mutual friend, Cindy, come in and do some work inside of her DEI lens. Now that actually never happened, but Cindy and I continued to connect with each other. We realized that we both had a very strong commitment around racial equity, and she invited me to do some consultation with her through the C-Suite, and eventually, through her wisdom, said we need to really develop a particular slide around mental health and how that works its way into some of the training on anti-racism. And eventually that one slide turned into an entire model. And that is where H.E.A.L came from. The vision was really to create a solution to the void in DEI work. And also the void in psychological first aid, because those tend to be 2 distinct paths. In the field of psychology, when we have critical incidents, We have mental health professionals come in to do first aid, psychological first aid, and it doesn't really address issues around equity or issues really around systemic changes in the workplace. And then with DEI, typically the traditional efforts focus on inclusion and belonging and racial equity, but not necessarily understanding how to address literally the mental health, the emotional and psychological functioning of employees in the wake of very serious racism, racial violence, other acts of hate and violence. So what we did was we merged the two. So H.E.A.L is really a combination of some of the traditional DEI efforts that focus on looking at unpacking racism in the workplace, along with having a race-related and psychologically and trauma-informed model of how to process the emotion in the wake of some of these acts. And H.E.A.L is really simple. The H stands for healing racial trauma in the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color. E is exploring unconscious or conscious bias. A is allyship to dismantling, particularly anti-blackness. And L, leveling the playing field through equity and inclusion. So those are the four essential components of H.E.A.L, and it's really now broadened to deal with the BIPOC community and dismantling racism in the workplace through a holistic approach.
Absolutely. Wow, that was actually very insightful, Dr. Jamila. I myself have never really made that connection. So it was really good to hear from you. And Cindy, as a follow-up, you both have built your businesses in your own respective areas of expertise and could have easily continued that way. But why is it important for this work to be interdisciplinary?
Yeah, excuse me. It's really a lot of what Dr. Jamila just shared. We were both seeing impacts of racial trauma in the workplace, but from different angles. And there's a lot certainly that we can accomplish independently, but I think a lot of those angles sometimes fall holistically short in addressing a very layered, complex set of issues. I will tell you, in my experience, it's been fairly clear that even among people who are deeply experienced in HR or even in DEI, they're not always equipped to hold certain conversations, like the ones that need to be had around racial trauma and anti-racism and mental health. And even for organizations or leaders that consider themselves to be progressive, those that want to commit to systemic change, there's still a lot of trust and repair that needs to happen so that everyone can feel psychologically safe. So when the trust has been broken between people and their colleagues, and when people feel as though they have been continually unseen, devalued, have been made to second guess themselves in the workplace, even as organizations begin to address systemic issues, those who have been impacted or maybe dealing with racial trauma, they still need healing, right? And if people are expected to show up to work, to give their best, to take on the stress of everything that we know work is, if they're expected to handle all of those priorities and yet haven't processed what may be happening to them or to people who look like them, they may not naturally have that weight taken off their shoulders, right? They may not be able to thrive as other people can in the workplace. On the other end, so that's what I'm seeing in the DEI space. On the other end, with what Dr. Jamila does and people who, similarly take on patients, they may be able to support people with mental health and coping strategies and things of that nature. At the same time, a psychologist or a therapist in and of themselves won't have the power over making change in someone's workplace. So for Dr. Jamila and me, truly leveling the playing field means not only working on changing the systems and helping the workforce understand how to practice allyship and anti-racism and some of those things. It's also about supporting individuals and organizations and really dismantling those societal workplace and sometimes even internalized narratives, and certainly doing so in a way that prioritizes self and community care, because we definitely need to sustain ourselves long enough to achieve some of these outcomes that we're hoping for.
Interesting. Thank you, Cindy, for sharing that with us. Dr. Jamila, in your practice, can you share some of these examples of how racial trauma that happens in the workplace shows up? What are some of your own patients struggling with?
Yes, there is a time in which the clinical work turns left. And for many of my clients, when the situation came about where they were really faced with this onslaught of attacks on the Black community, particularly through the killings by police officers, a lot of the original issues that were the reason why they came into treatment, whether it be marital conflict or depression or anxiety or some other life transition milestone, everything came to a complete halt for many of my clients. And really the issue, which I've seen a lot over the years, and this was the first time that I actually felt like something more is needed than what I could provide in my my therapeutic work. The issue was this sense of helplessness and hopelessness, and it was this idea that there was this reality that no matter how much things are now captured, even on camera, even when there are loads of witnesses, that there are still these senseless acts of violence in ways that they were going into work really not knowing how to handle. I'll give you a couple of key examples without disclosing any names, but I had, just for sake of argument, one client who really talked about this notion, what I would call of white silence, and what it meant to continuously go into work, maybe after one of the critical incidents, whether it's George Floyd or any of the high profile incidents of 2020, and people are engaging in business as usual conversations, right? At the opening of meetings, at the, on their Slack channels, if people are in person, at their team meetings, no acknowledgement about what's happening. And there's this sense of anger and resentment about the lack of acknowledgement that something has happened to a member of our community. And even though they may not know them, the sense of linked fate that, this is a person of our larger cultural community never quite was acknowledged and understood. And so people were asking basic questions like, hey, how was your weekend? After CNN played image after image of Chauvin on George Floyd's neck, the weekend was tragic, and so for someone to just ask that question in a very, I guess what they thought benign way, was very harmful and damaging. Another very clear theme that came up was the distractibility, and the idea that for many of these clients who were all clients of color, they didn't have the luxury of just thinking about their deliverables for the day. They were worrying about themselves, their families, the larger Black community on a grander scale. Are my children okay? When you see what's happening to people who look like you, there's a lot of antennas that start to go up. Could this happen to my nephew? Could this happen to my uncle, my daughter? And so just really not feeling like they could concentrate at the work at hand. And then the third theme that I'll probably share that came across very strongly was feeling as if there were sort of negative attributions that were made when they chose to keep distance and to create space when they were sort of collectively mourning. I had a client who said that they were actually really targeted and was asked, why aren't you eating with the rest of us? Why are you sitting in your office having lunch? Don't you like your job? And not realizing that that was an act of self-preservation, because sometimes being in spaces of people who are of the dominant group after the wake of some of these attacks really can be triggering. To be in a sea of whiteness, to be in a sea of people who have both leadership positions, which is control, and whiteness. And so having their space not be respected and being criticized in that way. So those are some very critical examples that I think came up that, again, very common in the wake of all the racial and civil unrest.
Thank you, Dr. Jamila, for sharing those. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge these are all valid. And I can think of many instances where even I've found myself desensitized to situations because of how often they've happened. So thank you so much for sharing that. And nonetheless, companies and leadership will do things, they'll support. But Cindy, I want you to touch on what ways have traditional DEI programs maybe fallen short of supporting people of color who may be dealing with racial trauma. I'm sorry, Cindy, I think, yeah.
I'm on mute. This is 2021, 2020, 2021. I'm on mute. Firstly, I think that there can be a lack of acknowledgement of how organizational practices and people within organizations play a part in the mental health challenges that people of color may struggle with. I say this all the time. I'm a very strong believer that if you can't name something, then it's hard to go then fix it or to intervene, if no one will admit that there is even a problem. And so that is the first barrier that I see with a lot of these programs. They're not always naming the real issue. And the real issue at hand, as far as what we're talking about tonight, is racism. Second, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in how organizations tend to approach a lot of DEI issues is in how they address closing performance gaps. So, and I'll put performance in quotes, by the way. So what I often see is the programs and the focus is often on changing the person of color. So how can we get this person to show up more like the dominant culture? Never mind if that may mean more energy and more time spent covering important aspects of that individual and who they feel they are. Or even the feelings of imposter syndrome that this can then drive, because the person is not only looking around them and seeing that there are so few people in certain roles who look like them, they're also wondering if there's so much about me that needs to change or needs fixing, why am I even here? Why should I even be here? So I think the intent is often to give people coaching and tools to help them figure out how to operate in an environment. However well-intended, there's often entirely too much focus on fixing people of color and not enough focus on the rules, the new rules that we need to come up with. Because the rules that currently govern most organizations are those that are set in white and Western and, frankly, even male ways of operating. And so we need to think about that in terms of how we even decide what strong performance is and how we should be addressing that. The third place I think DEI programs tend to fall short is, while mental health is certainly a topic that's becoming less and less stigmatized and more openly discussed, I think that there's still a lot of way to go in terms of looking to modernize how we talk about this, how we see people as whole human beings, and intentionally and thoughtfully provide education and awareness around mental health and the ways of noticing if someone may be dealing with something, coping and addressing challenges, all of those things, I think there's room for a lot of education around mental health in particular. And the last thing I'll share here is that so much of what we're talking about in the workplace in particular can happen so subtly, almost imperceptibly. And so it can be challenging to prove that someone did in fact commit a microaggression against you, or some other act of racism. And so I think it's important for organizations to really examine how they allow people to feel heard, and to really intentionally try to understand when people share their experiences, whether or not it's your own experience, whether or not we understand their response, we have to make room and give space to be able to validate people, because that's really where there's such a big breakdown. And again, if we can't even say that there's a problem, then we're never really going to be able to fix what exists in particular as it relates to racial trauma.
Absolutely. Yes. And I mean, essentially, as you said, naming the issue by its name, and not trying to change the people, right? But the actual culture. Any other recommendations for what organizations should do instead?
Yeah. I think fundamentally, we do have to be able to name things first and foremost. And there's probably some work and coaching and training to be done, particularly with leaders and people who manage other people, on how to make room for people, how to validate experiences, how to properly check in with people when something may be going on. I think there's a lot of opportunity to help people with that. Oftentimes I hear folks are afraid of making mistakes, saying the wrong thing, awkward conversations. And that fear, while it may be valid, and we're all human and we all have those moments of, ooh, I'm not really sure if I should step in here. What ends up happening is it perpetuates silence. And that silence that Dr. Jamila talked about speaks loudly for a lot of people. And so really helping really everyone, but certainly people who manage and lead other people, understand how to approach these situations, I think would be really important. I think as far as back to my comment on fixing people, I 100% think coaching and mentorship programs, they have a place, and there are some stats that tell us that they do boost the numbers of people of color into higher levels of an organization. The organization also, in tandem, needs to take a good look of how they define what success looks like. So really taking a look at the criteria that they're using to decide who gets an opportunity, who gets promoted, who's the default by which every other person gets measured, right? Like I said, so many of our organizations are built on white and Western ways of operating. We have to consider who does that benefit and who does that disadvantage, and the toll that it can take on people of color. So all of those things need to be dismantled. I rethink notions of professionalism and focus on outcomes instead. And I won't go on my soapbox around professionalism right now, but I'm happy to go into it later. But that should be really dismantled in most organizations to help people understand what are truly the skills and outcomes that you're looking for, and focus on that. I would eliminate the word meritocracy from the vocabulary. This idea of meritocracy gives the illusion of fairness, that everyone who's gotten to a particular place in their career has done so simply because they have worked hard. And by default, meritocracy then implies that people who don't achieve the same things, the problem must be with them. So I think these are some core principles that organizations can look to really rethink their coaching and mentoring programs and what they should look like to be truly helpful and impactful to people of color. And then the last thing I'll share is there just needs to be more education, awareness building around mental health challenges broadly to help people understand if they may be experiencing trauma, what the resources are for them to get help, help and support, manager training and coaching in particular, and in general, how do you identify if something has changed about someone, their behavior, their energy has shifted? What are the ways to perhaps support a colleague that may be going through something?
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Cindy. And we know that you've actually advised organizations and leaders on building more inclusive and equitable workplaces. But for those of you who are with us today and aren't aware, Cindy's also a coach. She's mentored other people of color throughout their career on how to navigate the workplace. So, what advice do you have for those who are feeling stuck or not necessarily valued in their work?
Yeah.
What resources or guidance do you have for folks?
Yeah, thank you, Camilo. I think it's important for people to know, first and foremost, that if they're experiencing signs of trauma, of stress, anxiety, overwhelm, it's not them. Many of us have been there, and it's important to name and acknowledge our own feelings because we're human. And so we should be able to feel anything that we need to feel in these moments. I think that's important. If possible, find someone who can serve as a coach or a confidant, a sounding board for some of the things that you may be going through so that you can process and deal with them. I think having that person to bounce things off of and really organize and process what may be coming up is important. If it's someone internally, obviously you want to think about someone who you trust, who can validate you, who can make sure that they help you strategize on some steps that you can take within the organization, maybe make sense of the experiences that you're having. And for some, especially if they don't have that confidant or person within the organization that they could go to, maybe thinking about who externally from the organization can give you some objective perspective. The point here is that hopefully no one has to go through this type of experience alone. And so having people who can help you process, I think is important. For a lot of people, leaving their place of work is just not a great option, right? They may have responsibilities, financial needs, and things of that nature. So for a lot of us, we may have to consider what are the options for staying within our current organization and sort of working and navigating using the resources that we may have while practicing self-care. So you might ask your HR department, what are some mental health offerings or resources that are available? A lot of organizations have employee assistance programs, but there may be other more specific resources available. If they aren't, maybe it's something that collectively, if a group of people request, the organization might take note. You could ask for flexibility that you need. It's not always possible, but I do think that with the pandemic, a lot of people who work in office spaces, that has opened up different ways of working and still being productive. And for a lot of people of color, that distance from their day-to-day, where they may not have to experience microaggressions as much as they might have physically in an office, that's actually taken a little bit of weight off their shoulders. And so if you're someone who finds that you are more productive at home, you feel safer at home, there may be an option for you to think about what flexibility can you get even staying within your current workplace. You can request safe spaces, whether it's through existing employee resource groups, ERGs, or perhaps you might ask the organization to start one or to start forums where similar people with similar experiences can come together to process, to support each other, to provide guidance. That could be helpful. And I would also say this work shouldn't only fall on us to have to figure out for ourselves. And so if you are connected with any allies within your organization, I would think about how you might leverage their power and their influence to ask for some of these things as well, right? So are there people who might be willing to challenge the status quo, to request resources, to educate other people on behalf of the communities that they're looking to show up for and to show solidarity with? So I would be thinking about, are there allies that can help move some of these things forward as well?
Thank you for sharing that, Cindy. And yeah, I definitely noticed mental health days are certainly something that has become common among many organizations. But Dr. Jamila, given that many organizations don't actually integrate mental health into their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, what are some of those recommendations for how employees can engage in their own self-care to better cope with the race-related events?
Mhm. Well, it's such a good question, Camilo, and I am always inspired by Audre Lorde in this way, where she's talked about self-care as an act of resistance, and that part of the way that we can show up as warriors in the fight for racial equity is in taking care of ourselves. We really don't have the luxury of wasting our most precious resource, which is ourselves. But unfortunately, I think for a lot of people of color, there's a narrative about what it means to be down for the cause. And we oftentimes have this false and misleading narrative about self-sacrifice. So I think the first thing is just to release that narrative, that cultural narrative sometimes, that you have to be the sacrificial lamb. And there are some very basic things that I think we can do to help shield ourselves from what we call vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, which is when you are indirectly traumatized because of the consumption of very vivid images, stories, even scrolling, in social media, where, you can really begin to be taxed by hate, anti-blackness sentiments. It's everywhere. And so the first thing is really being able to understand the power of removing yourself from certain situations that are truly depleting, that are not supportive, even relationships at work. I've had a number of conversations with people, even in my personal network, where they've said, 2020 was the year of unfriending people on social media. Because if they didn't have comments or feelings or reactions about what was going on in this country, it was offensive for them. And they felt like, maybe we are not as like-minded and like-spirited as I thought. And so while you may not be able to remove yourself from your position at work or your particular roles and responsibilities, there are ways that you can protect yourself from the visual reminders of individuals who may not show up for you, or people who you want to create solidarity or allyship with. And so really thinking about how to request at times things that could advocate for, turning off your camera in a meeting. Sometimes that's an act of self-preservation, if you're feeling triggered by things. Being able to recognize that mindfulness activities are really, really helpful in being able to center our energy and create a grounding. Mindfulness activities are where we really just focus our attention and we ground ourselves in our senses. So we may be mindful of bringing in certain affirmations around, I matter, my people matter, as I'm eating, lunch at my desk, or really thinking about ways of engaging in guided imagery, where if you feel as if there are intrusive thoughts, right, or images that keep coming into your mind. I know I had a lot of people that couldn't get the image of George Floyd on the ground with Chauvin's neck on, knee on his neck, and then him calling out for his mother. That's like an auditory, trigger, and so many mothers were holding that, that collective pain of their son calling out for them. So really thinking about, how do I create new neural pathways, when they are constantly bombarded by all of these negative images. And that's what guided imagery is about. So really starting to engage in visualization exercises where you can really prime yourself with positive images, of affirming images, images and affirmations that speak to cultural pride. I also find that we have to go back to the basics. For a lot of individuals who are dealing with secondary trauma, the first things to go are food, sleep, and exercise. Those are sort of our pillars to self-care. My grandmother used to say, you're going to dig your grave with a knife and fork. And that was her way of basically saying, when you overeat, you're essentially, you're going to have a shortened life, and you need to be careful about that. And I think about that with the way in which many people engage in emotional eating as a coping strategy. And for many people of color, there's a lot of tradition in food. And that's a positive thing. But when it starts to be combined with a feel-good behavior or a fix-it behavior, when we are not, functioning at our best, then we start to run the risk of, all kinds of health conditions, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and that has a negative impact on our mental health as well. It creates a double whammy. Sleep hygiene is critical. So many people in the wake of the George Floyd killing and even the Chauvin trial, they were staying up waiting, for the delivery of the verdict. It was almost as if they could not read about it. They had to experience it in real time. And what that means to your sleep patterns when you're literally up with all of the stimulation coming in, processing this information and waiting for it. So really, I started to subscribe to CNN would give you the top 5 stories at the top of every day to your email. And I use that as an alternate approach, as opposed to being locked into the television, so that I could cut down my consumption of material that could potentially raise anxiety, raise tension, raise anger. And so these are some things that I think we should be thinking about as we consider self-care. And finally, I would just say faith. Faith, it has been something that has carried us for generations, and recognizing that we have a strong connection to spirit. We have a strong connection to our ancestors. We have a strong connection to the land, and we have a strong connection to higher power. And so for many people in this season of racial and civil unrest, really being able to think about how to delve into their spiritual practices and how to ensure that those things are really baked in to their self-care regimen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamila. We really, and I'm speaking, I know on behalf of our attendees, thank you so much for sharing these great insight, not just on the mental health, but also physical health. Much necessary. I mean, we all know this particular year now, 2 years, 2020, 2021, it's been a defining moment in history. And I want to take a moment. We would like to take a quick pulse check, given that the last year, as mentioned, it's been a year of highly visible traumatic racial events. So we want to hear from you. How are people feeling about the recent racial violence, the anti-blackness sentiments, anti-Asian xenophobia, legislation targeting trans youth? I mean, there is so much civil unrest during this last year. If you want, please come off of mute, or feel free to write in the chat. It could be a one-word feeling. We want to hear from you and open up the discussion. for those of you who've joined us. And as you share with us, Dr. Jamila and Cindy are happy to share some initial thoughts on what may be coming up for you. So go ahead or if you want to protect your privacy, you can direct message me the question or the C-suite, and we can go ahead and ask, or again, just share with us how are you feeling, because we understand that again, this is valid, and it's been a heavy year.